For years, detectives Ramsey and Holt had run roughshod over Southside Chicago, their badges a twisted license to terrorize. They'd raided homes on flimsy lies, pocketing cash and valuables from the very folks they'd sworn to protect, their fists silencing anyone bold enough to challenge them. But one stormy night, they crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Fueled by a vague tip about shady dealings, they kicked down the door of Mike Tyson's row house on 63rd Street. No warrant, no hesitation, just raw, unchecked power. Mike, a retired Delta Force legend fresh from covert ops overseas, stood there, unarmed, minding his own damn business. The air crackled with tension as rain hammered the windows, the flickering streetlights outside casting jagged shadows across his hardwood floor. Ramsey smirked, his hand twitching near his holster, while Holt barked orders like he owned the place. Mike didn't flinch. He'd faced worse in war zones, but when he coolly demanded they back off, citing his rights, their response was swift and brutal. Holt lunged, slamming him against the wall while Ramsey ransacked the place, hunting for anything to pin on him. They didn't know who they'd just provoked. This wasn't some defenseless local they could bully. This was Mike Tyson, a man trained to kill with his bare hands. The storm outside roared louder, but inside, a bigger tempest was brewing, one that'd leave these dirty cops wishing they'd never stepped foot in his house. The rain pounded Southside Chicago like a war drum that night, the kind of relentless downpour that drowned out screams and soaked through the soul. Inside Mike Tyson's row house on 63rd Street, the air was thick with menace as detectives Ramsey and Holt loomed over him, their badges glinting like cheap threats under the dim kitchen light. Mike, a retired Delta Force commander who'd stared down death in deserts and jungles, stood calm. Too calm, his broad shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides. He wasn't some punk they could shake down. He'd just gotten back from overseas, trading battlefield chaos for a quiet life, or so he thought. But these cops didn't care. They'd stormed in without a warrant, their tip about shady activity as flimsy as the excuses they'd used on dozens of homes before. Ramsey's eyes flicked over Mike like he was sizing up prey, while Holt's sneer said it all. They figured he'd roll over like the rest. Big mistake. When Mike stepped forward, voice low and steady, and told them they had no right to be there, the room went electric. "I know the law," he said, his words cutting through the storm's roar outside. "You don't belong here." Ramsey's smirk vanished, replaced by a twitch of rage. Nobody talked back to him, especially not some black guy in a neighborhood they owned. Holt cracked his knuckles, itching for a fight, and muttered, "You're gonna regret that." Mike didn't budge. He wasn't armed, hadn't done a damn thing wrong, but that didn't matter to these badge-wearing thugs. They'd brutalized folks for less, and tonight, they were hell-bent on making an example out of him. The tension snapped like a tripwire. Ramsey barked, "Step outside now." But Mike held his ground, his gaze locked on them, unyielding. "Not without a warrant," he shot back, his tone daring them to try something. That's when Holt lunged, slamming a meaty fist toward Mike's jaw. But the ex-soldier's reflexes were razor-sharp. He sidestepped, the punch grazing air, and the room exploded into chaos. Ramsey charged in, grabbing for Mike's arm, but years of Delta Force training kicked in. Mike twisted free, his movements fluid, lethal, a predator cornered in his own den. The storm outside raged harder, lightning flashing through the busted front door, illuminating the scene like a gritty crime flick. These cops weren't just breaking the law. They were stepping into a lion's cage, and Mike was done playing nice. Holt swung again, wild and sloppy, but Mike ducked low, his eyes burning with a quiet fury they couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just defending his home. He was fighting for every ounce of dignity they'd tried to strip away. Ramsey snarled, "You're finished, tough guy." But his voice faltered. He hadn't expected this. They thought they'd waltz in, rough him up, and walk out heroes. Instead, they'd unleashed a force they couldn't control. The walls shook as thunder roared, mirroring the clash inside. Two corrupt cops versus a man who'd survived wars they'd never understand. And then, just as Holt reached for his taser, Mike's glare promised one thing. This wasn't over. Now here's where you come in, folks. If this showdown's got your heart racing, drop a 1 in the comments and smash that subscribe button. We've got more jaw-dropping twists coming your way. Not feeling it? Hit the like button anyway and tell us why in French. Pourquoi pas, oui? Want to know how Mike turns this ambush into their worst nightmare? Stick around, because next time, the streets of Chicago get bloody and we're spilling secrets you won't believe. What's your guess? Will Mike take them down, or will Ramsey and Holt bury him first? Comment below and let's keep this fire burning. The storm over Southside Chicago howled like a beast unleashed, rain slashing against Mike Tyson's row house on 63rd Street as the chaos inside hit a boiling point. Detectives Ramsey and Holt, drunk on their own power, had crossed every line, breaking in without a warrant, tossing his place like it was their personal playground. And now, they'd gone too far. Ramsey's fingers tightened around a small velvet case he'd pried from Mike's dresser, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming war medal, a hard-earned relic from Mike's Delta Force days. The ex-commander's eyes narrowed, a flicker of rage igniting behind his calm facade as Holt pocketed it with a smug grin, twirling it like some cheap souvenir. "Nice trinket," Holt sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. That was the spark. Mike's voice sliced through the air, low and deadly. "Put it back. Now." The room froze, the storm's roar outside amplifying the weight of his words. Ramsey chuckled, a hollow, condescending sound, but Holt's grin faded. He sensed the shift, the predator waking up in the man they'd underestimated. They weren't dealing with a civilian anymore. They'd poked a warrior forged in blood and fire. Mike stepped forward, hands still open but coiled with intent, every muscle primed from years of combat. The cops exchanged a glance, arrogance warring with unease, but they'd committed. No turning back. Holt moved first, ripping the taser from his belt, the crackle of electricity cutting through the damp air. "You're done, Tyson," he barked, firing the prong straight at Mike's chest. The jolt hit like lightning, a white-hot surge locking his body for a split second, pain searing through every nerve. But Mike didn't crumble. Teeth gritted, he roared through the agony, ripping the prongs free with a snarl, blood streaking his shirt as the storm's thunder shook the walls. Ramsey lunged, slamming a baton toward Mike's ribs, but the Delta Force vet was faster. His forearm blocked the blow, the impact shuddering through his bones. In one fluid motion, he twisted the baton from Ramsey's grip, flipping it like a blade, and drove his elbow into Holt's jaw with a sickening crunch. Holt staggered, blood spraying, but Ramsey recovered, charging with a feral yell. Mike sidestepped, planting a knee into Ramsey's gut, sending him crashing into the kitchen counter. Dishes shattered, glass exploding across the floor like shrapnel. The house was a battlefield now, rain pounding the roof as if cheering the carnage. Holt, dazed but furious, scrambled for his radio, fumbling to call for backup. But Mike was relentless. He yanked Holt by the collar, hurling him into the dresser. Wood splintered, the metal tumbling free. Mike snatched it midair, clutching it like a lifeline, his chest heaving as rage fueled his every move. Ramsey, gasping, reached for his gun, fingers trembling on the holster. Mike saw it. Time slowed, instincts screaming. Before the barrel could clear, he surged forward, slamming Ramsey's wrist against the wall, pinning him with a force that rattled the frame. "Not today," Mike growled, his voice a guttural promise. Holt, still reeling, lunged one last time, but Mike spun, driving a fist into his temple. Holt dropped like a stone, out cold. Ramsey's eyes widened, panic flashing as he realized they'd lost control. Mike stood over them, breathing hard. The metal gripped tight, rain hammering the busted door behind him. They'd come to break him, but he'd broken them instead. The fight was over, for now, but the war had just begun. The storm raged over Southside Chicago, a relentless howl tearing through the night as Mike Tyson burst from his shattered row house on 63rd Street, the taste of blood and fury still hot on his tongue. Detectives Ramsey and Holt lay sprawled inside, beaten, humiliated, but not done. The air crackled with danger as Mike hit the pavement, his boots pounding wet asphalt, the war medal clutched tight in his fist like a talisman. Rain lashed his face, soaking the torn sleeve where Holt's taser had grazed him. But pain was just fuel now. He'd fought them off, reclaimed what was his, but he knew these bastards wouldn't stop. The crack of a gunshot split the storm. Ramsey, staggering to his feet, had yanked his pistol free, firing wildly through the busted door. The bullet screamed past Mike's head, splintering a mailbox into jagged shards. He didn't flinch. Delta Force training kicked in, his body a machine of survival. But the second shot wasn't a miss. Fire ripped across his left arm, a grazing wound that painted his hoodie crimson, the shockwave nearly buckling his stride. Blood streamed down his skin, warm and slick, mixing with the rain. But he gritted his teeth and ran harder, the storm swallowing his ragged breaths. Behind him, Ramsey's roar cut through. The chaos. Get him! As Holt stumbled out, clutching his busted jaw, gun in hand. Their silhouettes loomed under the flickering streetlights, two predators unleashed, their rage unhinged. Another shot rang out, concrete exploding near Mike's feet, spraying gravel like shrapnel. The neighborhood jolted awake. Windows flashed with light, curtains twitched, but no one dared step out. This was Chicago's South Side. People knew the sound of death when they heard it. Mike veered sharp, cutting across a littered alley, his boots slamming puddles into sprays of muck. The pain in his arm screamed, a white-hot pulse, but he shoved it down. He'd survived ambushes in war zones. Two dirty cops weren't going to end him here. His mind raced. They weren't arresting him anymore. This was a hunt, execution style, a desperate bid to bury their screw-up before it hit the streets. Another bullet whizzed by, embedding into a rusted dumpster with a metallic clang, close enough that he felt the heat streak past his ear. Mike vaulted a chain-link fence, the metal rattling as he landed hard, his wounded arm protesting with a jolt of agony. A dog's feral bark erupted nearby, snapping at the shadows, but he didn't slow. The alley twisted ahead, brick walls closing in, the air thick with oil and decay. Ramsey's curses echoed behind, closer now, their boots pounding in pursuit, guns blazing with no regard for who might see. They wanted him dead, silenced, before the truth clawed its way out. Mike's pulse thundered, a steady war drum in his chest as he darted between parked cars, weaving through the maze of the block. Blood dripped onto the pavement, a scarlet trail they'd follow, but he wasn't stopping. Not yet. He needed cover, a plan, a way to turn this nightmare back on them. The storm roared approval, lightning cracking the sky as if daring him to fight. Ramsey and Holt thought they'd cornered prey. They were wrong. He was the hunter now, and Chicago's shadows would be their grave. The storm over Southside Chicago was a beast, its claws of rain and thunder tearing through the night as Mike Tyson staggered into a shadowed alley off 63rd Street, blood dripping from his grazed arm, the war medal still clenched in his fist. Ramsey and Holt's gunfire echoed behind him, their bullets ripping through the air like hounds on his heels, but he'd slipped their grasp. For now. His breaths came sharp, controlled, the pain a dull roar he'd learned to ignore in Delta Force hellholes far worse than this. The alley reeked of oil and rot, dumpsters looming like silent sentinels as he pressed against a brick wall, scanning for an out. Those cops weren't chasing to cuff him. They wanted him erased, a ghost no one would mourn. But Mike wasn't alone anymore. A rusty garage door creaked open ahead, and a figure emerged, Jimmy Evans, his old squad mate, eyes wide with recognition. "Get in, man," Jimmy hissed, yanking him inside as the storm's howl masked their move. The door slammed shut, plunging them into dim light, the scent of motor oil grounding Mike as his chest heaved. Jimmy didn't waste time. "Jesus, Mike, you're bleeding," he snapped, grabbing a rag to press against the wound. Mike waved him off, voice low and steely. "Ramsey and Holt, they hit my place, took my medal, tried to bury me." Jimmy's face darkened, fists clenching. He'd seen crooked cops ruin lives before, but this was personal. "We need help," he growled, pulling a burner phone from a drawer. Minutes later, tires screeched outside and Ray Lawson burst in, a journalist with a nose for corruption and a vendetta against Chicago's dirtiest. His leather jacket glistened with rain, his gaze sharp as he sized Mike up. "Heard whispers about those two," Ray said, voice tight. "They've been shaking down this city for years. You're the one they couldn't break." Mike's jaw tightened. He wasn't broken, but he was hunted, and time was bleeding out with his arm. Then came the clincher, Detective Marcus Kane. The garage door rattled as he ducked in, badge glinting under the flickering bulb, his face a mask of grit and guilt. Kane had been sniffing around Ramsey and Holt for months, a lone wolf in a rotten precinct. And now he was all in. "They'll spin this. Say you're a cop killer on the run," he warned, his voice gravelly with urgency. "We've got one shot to flip it." Mike met his stare, the pieces clicking. Jimmy's loyalty, Ray's pen, Kane's badge. "We bait 'em," Mike said, his tone cold, certain. "Draw 'em out, catch 'em dirty." The room went still, the storm's fury outside mirroring the fire in their eyes. Ramsey and Holt thought they'd cornered him, but these three were his lifeline, a crew ready to turn the hunters into prey. Lightning flashed, illuminating the blood-streaked rag on the floor. The plan was set, and Chicago's streets were about to ignite. The storm over Southside Chicago turned the night into a war zone, rain slashing the streets like shrapnel as Mike Tyson stood. In the heart of 63rd Street, blood seeping from his grazed arm, the war metal still gripped tight. Inside Jimmy Evans's garage, the plan had crystallized. Mike was the bait, a walking target to lure Ramsey and Holt into a trap they couldn't slither out of. Ray Lawson had rallied witnesses, neighbors sick of the corruption, their phones ready to catch every move, while Detective Marcus Kane planted whispers in the precinct, dangling Mike's location like a bloody stake. Now, under flickering streetlights, the trap was sprung. Mike's boots hit the wet pavement, his breath steady despite the pain, his Delta Force instincts screaming as he heard the screech of tires. Ramsey and Holt's black sedan roared around the corner, headlights slicing through the downpour, their faces twisted with feral rage. They didn't hesitate. Holt leaned out, gun blazing, a bullet tearing through the air, grazing Mike's shoulder with a hot, searing sting. He stumbled, blood blooming fresh but stayed upright, hands raised, a defiant silhouette against the storm. The street erupted. Windows cracked open, porch lights flared. Dozens of eyes locked on the scene, phones glowing as the crowd recorded. Ramsey snarled, slamming the brakes, both cops leaping out, guns drawn, their shouts swallowed by thunder. "You're done, Tyson!" Holt bellowed, firing again, the shot splintering a lamppost as Mike dropped to one knee, playing the part. Unarmed, vulnerable, a man they could finish. But they didn't see the net closing. Holt charged, his pistol aimed for the kill, when a voice sliced through the chaos. "Stand down!" Marcus Kane stepped from the shadows, badge gleaming, his presence a wall of authority. Ramsey froze, eyes darting, but Holt's finger twitched, his fury blinding him to the crowd, the cameras, the trap. Another shot rang out, clipping Mike's side, and the crowd gasped, voices rising. "He's down! They shot him!" Blood pooled beneath Mike, rain washing it red across the asphalt, but his eyes burned alive, locked on Holt. The cop hesitated, realization dawning too late. They weren't in control anymore. Kane advanced, voice steel. "Drop it, Holt, now!" Ramsey's jaw tightened, his gun wavering as the streetlights caught every angle, every witness, every damning second. The neighborhood wasn't silent anymore. People shouted, phones thrust forward, capturing the cops unraveling. Holt's hand shook, his snarl fading to panic as he saw the tide turn. Ramsey barked, "Back off, Kane," but his voice cracked, power slipping through his fingers like the rain. Mike rose slowly, bloodied but unbowed, a warrior they couldn't break. The storm roared its climax, lightning framing the standoff as Kane closed in, the crowd's fury a living thing. Ramsey and Holt were cornered, their execution foiled by the very people they'd terrorized. This wasn't over, but the hunters had just become the hunted. Yo, if this showdown's got you hyped, smash that one in the comments and subscribe. Mike's revenge is just heating up. Not your vibe? Drop a like and tell us how you'd end these cops, in Spanish, ¿por qué no? Curious if Ramsey and Holt crash and burn next? Stick around, drop your wildest guess below, and let's see who's got the sharpest instincts for the next bloodbath. The storm had faded over Southside Chicago, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake, but the air inside the Cook County courtroom crackled with a different kind of fury. Mike Tyson sat near the front, his bandaged shoulder stiff under a crisp shirt, bloodstains a memory now etched into 63rd Street's pavement. Across the room, Ramsey and Holt slumped at the defendant's table, their once arrogant swagger replaced by hollow stares, cuffs glinting where badges used to shine. The trap had worked. Mike, Jimmy Evans, Ray Lawson, and Marcus Kane had turned the hunters into prey, exposing their corruption to a city that had finally had enough. Witnesses from that rain-soaked night, neighbors with phone footage, voices raw with outrage, had flooded the precinct with evidence. Holt's unprovoked shots, Ramsey's barked orders, Mike's hands raised in surrender. The footage went viral, a tidal wave of truth drowning the precinct's lies. Now, months later, the gavel was poised to fall, and the tension was a live wire ready to snap. The gallery buzzed with reporters, their pens scratching like vultures circling a kill, while former victims, men beaten and robbed by these same cops, watched with steely resolve. The judge, a stern woman with eyes like granite, took her seat, her presence silencing the room. "Matthew Ramsey and Daniel Holt," she began, voice cutting through the hush, "you stand convicted of abuse of power, assault, and attempted murder." Ramsey's jaw clenched, a vein pulsing in his neck while Holt's hands balled into fists, knuckles white against the table. "Your actions," she continued, "betrayed the trust of this community, leaving scars that will not fade." The words landed like blows. 15 years for Ramsey, 12 for Holt, no parole. A gasp rippled through the crowd as the sentences sank in, restitution numbers rolling out next. Hundreds of thousands to Mike for his trashed home, his wounds, his stolen medal. The judge's gavel crashed down, a thunderclap sealing their fate. Ramsey's head snapped toward Mike, eyes burning with a hatred that hadn't dimmed, but Mike met his gaze, unyielding. A Delta Force Titan who'd taken their best shots and still stood tall. Holt slumped, muttering curses under his breath, his bravado shattered as bailiffs closed in. The courtroom doors swung open, and they were let out, footsteps echoing like a death march past officers who'd once covered for them. Now, those same cops turned away, the precinct cutting them loose like dead weight. Mike rose slowly, his frame a quiet storm of strength, the weight of victory settling into his bones. Outside, Chicago's skyline loomed under a gray dawn, the city waking to a new reality, one where two predators had been caged. But Mike knew this wasn't the end. It was a reckoning. Ramsey and Holt were down, their empire of fear crumbled, yet the system that bred them still lurked. As he stepped into the cold air, the scars on his body pulsed, a reminder that justice had been won, but the war was far from over. The gray dawn broke over Southside Chicago, casting long shadows across 63rd Street as Mike Tyson stepped out of the Cook County courtroom, the weight of victory pulsing through his battered frame. Ramsey and Holt were gone, locked away for 15 and 12 years, their reign of terror crushed under the gavel's final blow, but the air still crackled with an unfinished edge. Mike's shoulder throbbed beneath fresh bandages, a roadmap of scars from that rain-soaked night when Holt's bullets had torn through him, yet he stood tall, unbreakable. The city buzzed around him, sirens wailing in the distance, horns blaring from early commuters. But his row house loomed ahead, a quiet fortress reclaimed from chaos. Inside, the walls bore the scars of that first invasion. Splintered wood, shattered glass, echoes of Ramsey's smug threats. Now it was his again, and with the restitution cash, hundreds of thousands strong, he had the means to rebuild, to carve out something new from the ashes of their war. The front door creaked open, and Jimmy Evans stood there, arms crossed, his weathered face softening into a rare grin. "You made it, man," he said, voice rough with relief, stepping aside as Ray Lawson and Marcus Kane lingered in the living room, their presence a silent testament to the fight they'd won together. Jimmy had patched him up in that garage, Ray had turned the street's whispers into a megaphone of truth, and Kane had risked his badge to bury the bastards who'd hunted him. The room hummed with tension, not from danger, but from the raw, unspoken bond forged in blood and grit. Mike exhaled, rolling his shoulder, the dull ache a reminder of how close he'd come to losing it all. "They're gone," he said, voice low, steady. "But this city's still rotten." Ray nodded, leaning against the wall, his journalist's eyes sharp with the weight of stories yet untold. "You cracked it open, Mike. That's a start." Kane stepped forward, badge glinting under the dim light, his jaw tight. "Precincts scrambling. Chiefs playing cleanup, but the stink's too deep. You didn't just take down two cops. You shook the whole damn system." Mike's gaze drifted to the window, where the Chicago skyline loomed, a jagged beast of steel and secrets. The money was his now, a lifeline to rebuild, maybe even leave, but the fire in his gut burned hotter. He'd survived jungles, ambushes, and now this, a war on his own doorstep, and walking away wasn't in his blood. Jimmy clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm, grounding. "You're a damn legend, Tyson. What's next?" Mike's lips twitched, not quite a smile, as he pocketed the medal, its weight a promise. "I start over," he said. "My way." Outside, the street hummed with life, kids laughing, cars rumbling, ignorant of the Titan who'd just rewritten its rules. Mike stood in his doorway, the dawn painting him in shades of steel and shadow, a man who'd beaten the odds and left a crack in Chicago's corrupt heart. The battle was done, but the war simmered on, and Mike Tyson, Delta Force warrior, survivor, victor, was ready for whatever came next.